Hi class, this week we're going to talk about contrast, and contrast is one of the most important um, tools to use in design. It's considered an element of design, and when we talk about contrast, we're talking about contrast in size, small versus large, contrast in color, light versus dark, bright versus dull, texture, texture, smooth versus bumpy, all those things. So those are things I want you to think about. We've also already talked about negative and positive space and how important those are in terms of creating contrast and visual interest. We've also talked a little bit about focal point, which is creating an emphasis or a point of contrast in a design. And all of this that I'm going through is in week 3. It's the readings in week 3s. So let's look at some examples here. Here's contrast in shape. Okay. Here's another example of contrast in shape. And here's another. Here's some contrast in color. Okay, light versus dark, color versus more neutral tones, color being used with shapes, contrast of line, contrast of size, contrast of position. Okay? Okay, we're going to talk about scale and proportion. So when we talk about scale and proportion, we're really talking about size. Scale refers to the size of an element. Proportion refers to the relative size relationship among different parts of a whole. So here's an example of all the apples being the same size. Nothing is out of the ordinary. And scale can be a very powerful tool in design. Let's look at what happens if one of the apples are made smaller. In other words, the scale is changed, and so the proportion in relationship to the other apples is also changed. Here's what happens if we make one of the apples large. Okay, what if we put a large apple with a small apple? All right, let's move on to emphasis. So emphasis is created in a design where there's a center of interest or an area of the design that draws the attention of the viewer. In other words, a focal point. So I think in these examples it's pretty obvious what the focal point is and how it's being created. Difference in value, light and dark, is one way that it's being created. Here it's an absence of design. Here it's also an absence of design and a change in value. And here it's a change in value, meaning it goes from black to white or light to dark. Here's some examples of emphasis in art, and sometimes what is a focal point for one person is not a focal point for another person. So, like, for example, for me, the focal point in this image is the red. For someone else, it might be this figure. In this one, it's the red, too. So for me, I'm very sensitive to color. That may be why. Here is emphasis being created through position, which I think is very interesting. I think we can see that the boat is creating emphasis by its position and by its color, and the tear here by its position in the center, the teardrop. Here's emphasis through contrast in shape. Okay, let's look at gravity. Things have different visual weight. Sometimes darker or larger shapes appear to be heavier than smaller or lighter ones. Light colors tend to come forward. Large light shapes will come forward in space. Lots of artists play with this. Some try to make it, try to challenge the rules of what comes forward and what is heavy and what is light. So let's just look at some of these examples. Here's a balance of visual weight achieved through value and position. Same, shape and position. Value. So the dark shapes are going to the bottom in both of these. Here through value and size. All right. Let's go to movement and rhythm. So movement and design is created by arranging visual elements in a composition so they direct the viewer's eye to travel in a certain direction. Rhythm is a byproduct of movement. It describes the movement and is often achieved by incorporating repetitive visual units, in other words, creating a pattern. So let's look. Here's an example of rhythm. So the rhythm of the lines, the rhythm of the dots, and the movement is your eye travels through. Repetition is almost always used in movement and rhythm. So the repetition of these dots and the way they are receding in space by getting smaller in scale is helping to create the movement and rhythm in that piece. Here repetition is being used again, the repetition of the yellow shapes, the repetition of the blue shapes, the repetition of the brown shapes, all of that is creating movement and rhythm. Here's some asymmetrical compositions that are still balanced. So let's click on some of these and look at them. So here is a photo image which uses graphic text. That's kind of interesting. That's an example of page layout, an asymmetrical page layout. And let's look at some examples of asymmetrical composition in fine art. So these shapes, these large boat shapes, are balanced by the smaller shapes and the quieter sense of texture on the right side. This line in the center also helps to keep a balance between the top of the painting and the bottom of the painting. This little boat helps to offset these boats. Okay, so that's something, asymmetry and balance is something you can have a lot of fun with. So here's an example of an asymmetrical web design. Okay, I'll let you guys explore these yourself. And let's just look at the vocabulary of this week. Asymmetry, appearing different or irregular without symmetry, and everyone should be comfortable with what symmetry is at this point after week 2. Contrast, emphasis, focal point, proportion, scale, gravity, movement, rhythm, repetition, and pattern. So make sure you use and review that vocabulary. Okay? You guys are doing great, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you come up with this week.